What if the thing holding America together is not its military, not its democracy, not its constitution, but a 5-decade-old Americans have never heard of, and that is quietly coming apart right now? What if the true source of American global power, the mechanism that funds its military, inflates its standard of living, and forces the entire world to play by its rules, is not strength, but a structural dependency that the rest of the world has been trying to escape for years and may finally be succeeding? And what if the war currently unfolding in the Middle East is not simply a conflict over security or ideology or regional influence, but a direct assault on that mechanism? A challenge to the very financial architecture that makes America America. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want the kind of analysis that connects the dots the major networks leave deliberately unconnected. And when you have finished watching this video, leave me your answer in the comments. Do you think the petrodollar system can survive what is happening right now? Do you think America can survive the end of the petrodollar? I read every comment. Your thinking sharpens mine. Now let us go deep, because what I am about to walk you through is the most important story in global politics that almost nobody is telling clearly. Let me begin with a simple question that turns out to have a very complicated answer. Why is the US dollar the world's reserve currency? Most people, if they answer at all, will say something about American economic strength, the size of the American economy, the depth of American financial markets, the stability of American institutions, the rule of law, the liquidity of US Treasury bonds. These things are real, they matter, but they are not the primary reason the dollar holds the position it holds. They are, in significant part, the consequences of that position rather than its cause. The primary reason the dollar is the world's reserve currency is a deal struck in the early 1970s between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A deal so consequential, so structurally transformative, and so carefully kept out of public consciousness that understanding it is like suddenly being able to see the architecture of a building you have been living in for your entire life without ever noticing its structure. To understand that deal, you need to understand the crisis that made it necessary. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the modern global economy. He ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. Under the Bretton Woods system, established after the Second World War, the dollar had been the anchor of the global financial system precisely because it was convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This gave the dollar its credibility. Every country that held dollars knew they could, if necessary, exchange those dollars for a fixed quantity of gold. The dollar was not just a promise, it was a promise backed by something real and finite. But by the late 1960s, the United States had been spending far beyond its means. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, the simultaneous pursuit of guns and butter that Lyndon Johnson had promised and that the American economy could not actually sustain. The US was printing dollars faster than its gold reserves could support. Foreign governments, particularly France under de Gaulle, began exercising their right to convert dollar holdings into gold. The gold was flowing out. The system was under terminal strain. Nixon's decision to close the gold window, to simply end the convertibility of dollars into gold, was in one sense an act of pure financial default. The United States had made a promise backed by gold, and it broke that promise because keeping it had become too expensive. The world's reserve currency was now backed by nothing but the promise of the United States government and the confidence of the markets. For a few years, that confidence was genuinely shaky. The dollar fell, inflation rose, the global financial system entered a period of turbulence and uncertainty, and the question hung in the air: if the dollar is no longer backed by gold, why should the rest of the world continue to hold it? Why should the dollar remain the world's reserve currency at all? The answer to that question was negotiated between 1973 and 1975 in a series of meetings between American officials and the Saudi royal family, whose details remain classified for decades. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its consequences. Saudi Arabia, and through Saudi Arabia, OPEC, would price and sell oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi regime, American military protection, American weapons, American diplomatic cover, the full weight of American power deployed in service of Saudi dynastic survival. The effect was immediate and structural. Every country in the world that needed oil, and virtually every country in the world needed oil, now needed US dollars to buy it. Not because American products were superior, not because American financial markets were the deepest, though they would become deeper as a direct consequence of this arrangement, but because the most essential commodity in the global industrial economy could only be purchased in one currency. This created what economists call a structural demand for dollars. a demand that was not based on market choice or competitive merit, but on geopolitical compulsion. You needed oil. Oil cost dollars. Therefore, you needed dollars. Therefore, you needed to do things, export goods to America, borrow in dollars, hold dollar reserves, that kept you integrated into the dollar system, regardless of whether that integration served your independent economic interests. The United States had found something better than gold. It had found oil. It had anchored its currency not to a finite physical commodity that it had to actually possess, but to a global energy dependency that it could maintain through military power and political leverage. And the consequences for American power were extraordinary. Because the world needed dollars, America could print them. Because America could print them, it could fund its military. Because it could fund its military, it could maintain the security arrangements in the Gulf, in Europe, and Asia that kept the world dependent on the dollar. The system fed itself. It was, from the American perspective, as close to a perpetual motion machine as anything in the history of global finance. It allowed the United States to run trade deficits year after year without facing the currency collapse that would have destroyed any other economy doing the same thing. It allowed American consumers to import goods from the rest of the world at prices that did not reflect the full cost of producing them. It allowed the American government to borrow at interest rates lower than any other sovereign borrower. It allowed Wall Street to become the center of global finance, not purely through competitive excellence, but through structural privilege. The petrodollar system was, and remains, an invisible tax on the entire world. A tax paid not in money directly, but in the structural obligation to hold and use a currency that the United States controls, and that the United States can devalue, inflate, or weaponize according to its own interests. Now, let me tell you why this system is under greater strain than at any point in its 50-year history. The strains are coming from multiple directions simultaneously, and the Iran conflict, the war currently unfolding, is accelerating all of them. The first strain is the weaponization of the dollar itself. For decades, the United States used financial sanctions judiciously as a targeted tool of foreign policy deployed against specific actors in specific circumstances. But over the past 15 years, and dramatically accelerating since 2022, the United States has used dollar dominance as a blunt geopolitical weapon, cutting entire countries off from the SWIFT payment system, freezing sovereign foreign exchange reserves, imposing secondary sanctions that threaten any third-party actor that does business with designated countries. The freezing of Russian foreign exchange reserves in 2022 was a watershed moment. Not because it was wrong to pressure Russia, but because it demonstrated something that every finance ministry and central bank in the world immediately understood. Dollar reserves, the holdings that countries accumulate over decades of trade surplus, that they hold as the ultimate store of value, the ultimate insurance against financial crisis, are not actually theirs. They are held at the pleasure of Washington. They can be frozen, seized, or weaponized the moment American foreign policy decides that the country holding them has become inconvenient. Every country that watched Russia's reserves get frozen asked the same question: are we next? Under what circumstances would Washington decide that our reserves are now a legitimate target? How dependent do we want to be on a system that can be turned against us at any moment? The answer for a growing number of countries has been less dependent than we currently are. And the process of reducing that dependence, of diversifying reserves, building alternative payment systems, negotiating bilateral trade in non-dollar currencies has accelerated dramatically. China and Russia trade in yuan and rubles. India buys Russian oil in rupees. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting yuan for oil sales to China. The Gulf Cooperation Council has had serious internal discussions about pricing some oil in non-dollar currencies. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS countries, have been actively developing alternative financial infrastructure. The BRICS grouping has expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, and Egypt, creating a coalition that collectively represents a substantial share of global oil production and a growing share of global economic output. None of this has yet displaced the dollar. I want to be precise about that. The dollar remains by far the world's most important reserve currency and the primary currency of international trade. But the direction of travel, the trend line, is unmistakable. And trend lines, in geopolitics as in finance, have a way of accelerating at exactly the moments when the system they are undermining faces its greatest stress.